Hello, adventurers. My name is Dan, and this is the Dice20 Collective. Today, we're going to be talking about the Adventuring Day. The Adventuring Day is all about how you design your adventure. How many encounters do you have? How do you use player resources? How do you plan for traps and role playing interactions? All of this and more coming up on the Dice20 Collective. Okay, so here we are. We've got Dan up top, we've got Mike on the top right, and we got John on the bottom right. And so I think the first thing that we have to do here is really identify what the Dungeon Master Guide says about the Adventuring Day. So in the text, it discusses 6 to 8 medium encounters. If you look over the internet, though, that's obviously highly discouraged for various reasons that we'll get into. But the other major idea is maybe doing larger or harder encounters, and how does that look? So I think what we're going to run into today is really some points about how you deal with long and short rests. And there's different ways to do that. I mean, you can have normal rest system, heroic rest system, gritty realism, and we can kind of dive into some more of that. That's all part of the Dungeon Master Guide as well. But let's just first ask you, what are you guys most comfortable with considering doing the Adventuring Day? What are your initial thoughts? We'll start with Dan up top.
Well, it's funny. I think I was joking with Vespa and Dan about this not too long ago. As far as an Adventuring Day, like someone joked about medium or easy encounters, and I was kind of like, "What's the point of those?" So I feel like my day. I've noticed that, like as for anybody who watched the first video, I've only really been DN for 5 months and stuff, and it's been a module. So I don't know. I don't think I've fully wrapped my brain around necessarily planning out an Adventuring Day. So that's why I feel like this topic for me, I'm looking forward to kind of learning a lot from this one. So to me, it usually consists of maybe 1 or 2 encounters. I think Vespa just joined my group. Dan, you're in my group. The more I was thinking leading up to this, I was kind of thinking that there's probably 1 or 2 encounters, and then you guys get a decent rest in, So as far as a day, I don't know if there's necessarily a sense of that.
So in theory, you're as opposed to a bunch of small encounters, you're sort of used to doing 2 hard or difficult or deadly encounters.
I would say so, yeah.
Mike, what's your experience? You've been playing and DMing for a while, so.
I feel like this is a situation. Now, I will say this: Forf is the dish that I played the least out of all of these, and I know some of this is a reaction to Forf. But I feel like I never really had as much problem with this in 2 and 3 and 3.5 as I have had in 5th, trying to balance out encounters and the party's ability.
Because previously it was just a reset button, really kind of like long rest, like you got your spells back and health back. That's how earlier editions dealt with it.
Yeah, I think it was and I don't even think it was anything that formal. I think in AD&D, there was just the idea that spellcasters needed to take 8 hours to recoup their spells, but even that
it's all about spells.
Yeah, even that wouldn't heal everybody to maximum. I think you still had to use healing magic or other things. There was the natural healing system, I think, in 2E. So a long rest wasn't a complete blank slate, even all the way back in advance.
That's true. Your wounds traveled with you. That's right.
And this is something I'm going to probably keep saying this as long as we keep doing this videos. Whenever one of these concepts come up, I think you also have a definitional issue. Well, when you say the Adventuring Day, I think we have to start step back and ask what the Adventuring Day is, because when I first read that, my mind leaps to you're up at dawn, you go to bed at sunrise, sunset. You're traveling.
Like a 24-hour period.
Yes, or at the very least, the daylight hours, and then you set up camp. And when you set up camp, that's your long rest. Maybe breaking for lunch and afternoon tea; those are your 2 short rests.
Second breakfast.
Yeah, but and so I have never, in all my time as a DM, done 6 to 8 encounters per 8 to 12 hour block of overland travel. What I do, however, is if I think of an adventuring day as the dungeon crawl, you get to the dungeon, you're about to go in. I think 6 to 8 encounters before you get to the final room, the big boss, whatever. But if you don't think of an adventuring day as overland travel and think of adventuring day as I'm constructing my dungeon, the party has reached the doors of the dungeon, they're about to go in, and there's going to be 6 to 8 rooms or combat encounters or puzzles or traps before they get to the big bad end guy. Then I think that's maybe a better approximation of what adventuring day is, or at least in the terms that they're using. 6 to 8 encounters before, and then a long rest. But I would include puzzles, traps, anything that involves rolling dice or using resources. Those would be in my encounters. Anything to kind of soften them up.
I think that's a good point. Anytime you're using resources is part of that adventuring day.
Yeah.
So if you're using hit dice, if you get hurt from a trap, I think that's part of the adventuring day for sure. I think for me, the way I've always looked at it, even though it was called adventuring day, is I've always looked at it as the adventure, like the length of this particular adventure. Now, I use the gritty realism, and I've used both, of course, but I don't like the reset button that night. I don't think that works very well. I find that even I, as a player, am like, well, we used a couple resources through a harder encounter or two. Maybe we should rest for the night just in case there's a big one. Like, I noticed I do that. I see other players do that, but I do notice that using the gritty realism system and having time hacks, like if you've got to do this in 2-3 days and a long rest takes, 24 hours or even, whatever, right? But like then you start making decisions based on actual human thought, which is like, we should do this quickly. But I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a day. I think it's what your adventure consists of. And when you start looking at it like that, and a short rest could literally be a night of sleeping or a 5-minute rest. I'm pretty flexible on what my quote unquote short rest is. So that I can fit it into a dungeon crawl or something like that. But I think you got to look at it as your adventure. Like, what's the design of the adventure? And calling it the adventuring day really does make it seem like 24 hours. But it's more like, what do you need to do before you hit reset is the way I kind of look at it. But that's sort of a bad title. So I get why they use adventuring day.
I think the gritty realism is nice because it's really easy to if you just have long rests, right? You can't control when the players are going to long rest. So you might plan 6 to 8 encounters. They might long rest in between every 2 of them or something. Right. So I think I get what the intention is in the Dungeon Master's Guide to say 6 to 8 encounters, but like ultimately it's really hard for that to be applicable unless you're in a dungeon specifically, like Mike said, and then you don't have somewhere like you don't feel comfortable resting, or you can't like just exit and then go sleep in the woods, or can't make a camp or whatever, right? So I think that's important to consider as far as when you build up your adventuring day. So I look at the adventuring day as like whatever is between one long rest to the next long rest, whatever that time period is.
And I've had players try that whole let's go back out to the dungeon and come back in, or even. Can we bar the door of this one room? Just close the door and pile up luggage and move a couch over, and we can sleep for 8 hours, no problem.
That's why I think the gritty realism is good, because it's not just a quick, like boom, oh, we're long rested, no problem,
right.
Yeah. So I like that rule set better than just the regular, like you said, hit the reset button type of thing. And
I think it helps with narrative too. So you push storylines forward, and it's actually a lot easier, because when I have to push a storyline forward, because overnight sort of thing, sometimes that doesn't really work. But when it's like, okay, well, it's a 2 days or a week or whatever, that actually really helps me push. And of course, I'm doing a campaign, but it pushes the world forward in interesting ways, and it allows me to do that. Whereas sometimes just resting for that night, there's not enough time to make things happen.
I'll second what Vespa said. So the only time I experienced a gritty realism was in Dan's campaign. And I remember seeing in the initial kind of email he sent me describing it, I was like, well, that sounds terrible. Like, I have to wait.
Yeah, nobody liked it at first, Dan.
Yeah, like, what? But now that I've experienced it, it really does. It takes a little. It's like less video gamey. Hit the button and then rest for 8 hours. It's way more like realistic, and I think it makes you feel better about using your resources, and it makes them feel more important. And also, go ahead, Mike.
Here's what I worry about with that, though. Is I don't think that as a group we should just all say, well, the only solution is to do gritty realism. Like, if people don't want to do gritty realism, what are some other ways to handle this or balance this or approach this, just so that we're not the grognard party of realism,
Yeah, so to be fair to the Dungeon Master Guide, it does say after 6 to 8 encounters, that if you do harder encounters, just have them shorter, more deadly or more difficult, and then you can do less encounters. So 6 to 8 is just how I think they designed it. But I think, realistically speaking, people are only doing 2 to 3 probably.
Well,
That's my experience as
the
well.
idea of 6 to 8 sounds like just a grind, for both the players and the DM. I guess if you're creative enough where you're throwing traps or environmental things into the mix, but like 6 combats where it's not a dungeon, like what you just happen to stumble across that many bad guys and stuff like that, that sounds like a slog.
Actually, I think it works though. Like, listen, okay, so you go to the tower and you kill a couple guys, you use a couple resources, you had to stealth up there. And then you got to get through the courtyard, and then you get inside, and there was a guard room, and then you get inside, and there was another thing, and then you go fight the big boss. I mean, you're at 6 right there, if you know what I mean. And you've just went through a small keep. So I think it can be done, but the question is, well, none of them were very hard. So I guess it is a little bit of a different question. Should each encounter be hard, or should each encounter whittle away resources, right? I think that's a different type of discussion, right?
Well, here's my other thing when you start getting into, difficult encounters, difficulty of encounters, especially if we're thinking of the overland travel. Okay, we're going to have 2 or 3 days traveling to our destination, and each day, rather than have 6 separate wolf packs attack the party, we're going to have 2 to 3 deadly level encounters. Here's my issue with this. I know we're in a fantasy world, but at some point, how does the society not just collapse if no level 0 farmer can go out and till their crops without a random manicore dropping down on them? Like if everywhere you go, you're gonna see a manticore per hour. I mean, this world would just there'd be no society, there'd be no agriculture. This would just collapse.
And I think that's why people hate random encounters.
Sounds like you've been through Manticore Valley. Interesting.
The forest of manticores. There's no manticores.
It's a bad place to be. It's a bad place to be. Don't travel through there.
Well, I don't really this is a little different topic, but I'm not in love with the idea of throwing random encounters into something. Like, as a DM, if you designed something, you should probably throw it in there somehow. Now, it doesn't mean that if you went left and you had a forest encounter that you suddenly have to create a larger forest or something. I don't know. Make it work. Like, there should be an encounter left or right or whatever, but it shouldn't just be random. If that was part of your adventure design, make it meaningful, right? And I'd rather have fewer encounters that were harder or more elaborate that seemed like random but thematic than just, why are you throwing giant fucking bugs at me when I need to get to the castle to do something important,
I agree. That speaks to the point I was kind of saying, 6 to 8 encounters feels like a slog. If it just feels random, to me, that I don't know if that would be that fun for anybody necessarily. But to me, I would much rather have fewer that seem more relevant to the plot, or something like that, or a little bit more deadly. I
definitely think there's value in having those small encounters, though, just to kind of whittle away some of those sources, and like we're talking about. But if we are counting like traps and puzzles and different things into the encounter field, then I think 6 to 8 really does, could make sense or does make sense, right? And certainly as you get higher level as well, those make more sense because you have more resources that you're trying to churn through for the players to burn and that type of thing, So,
and that's a good question too. I don't think you can do a 6 to 8 encounter for level 0, 1, 2.
Certainly not. No,
I don't think you
not.
can do that. I don't think that applies. But
no.
I think the meat of it is really designed for 4th to 12th level maybe. And do you guys think that there's if you've played higher level campaigns, do you think that changes at any point?
I think in the higher level campaigns I've gotten to where we're 15 or 16, 17, mostly what my experience is that the encounters just become harder, right? So you're encountering these more majestic beasts, and the difficulty ramps up, not necessarily the number of encounters, but I guess I could see it going either way, but just my experience has been typically the DMs enjoy throwing tougher stuff at you because now you can throw a mind flare at the party or something, whereas you certainly couldn't do that before, right? So that's
where my DM strategy is. That's where I started getting into my ecosystems of the world. Where yes, you may be able to handle the young green dragon, but why is it here? And all of a sudden, so I just kind of have to set up all my deadly encounters, my hard encounters. I feel like I really have to set those up narratively versus for like a second or third level party. I have no problem rolling on a random encounter table to see, a pack of wolves is stalking you now. And
right.
I think that makes sense. But then also that same pack of wolves is gonna smell this 7th level party coming a mile away and just steer clear. And I'll just not mess with them at that point.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, I think the encounter should make sense. It shouldn't just be like, a random dragon flew down. I mean, it certainly could be. Don't get me wrong. People could do that
right.
or whatever.
I've had that happen.
Yeah, but that's, without purpose, I don't think that's the way to go about the game either. My opinion as well.
Well, I think on the other end of it, when I was designing encounters for my last campaign, it almost turned into, especially at higher levels, every encounter was basically really freaking hard. Because doing a medium encounter for high level characters just didn't have the same punch. It didn't pack the same punch. I mean, it uses resources, but it wasn't the same. And so I totally recognized that I was doing more like 4 encounters, hard encounters, or capping it off with like a deadly encounter. And then the next problem came in once I started making it so difficult. People started dropping at high levels even still. And then you start this whole circular pattern where it's like, well, I can't throw weak encounters at you. So I'm throwing only hard encounters. And people are dropping just as much as you did when you were, young adventurers.
And now they feel more incentivized to take more long rest because they're so beat up.
I think so.
Right.
A big thing I have not using gritty realism that I know I'm curious to hear you guys talk about is like the groups, like you were saying, Mike, they want to bar the door in the middle of a dungeon, or they clear out the first third of a dungeon. Like, well, I'm tired. Let's go back out and then we'll come back in tomorrow. Kind of how to handle some of that stuff. Like Dan, we've talked about like the idea of you get to a dungeon or a place, you kind of kick the door in and you want to clear the area. You want to try and, handle that whole situation.
The human wants to get this done. You don't kick the door in and say, all right, that was good for today.
Right. So, as you more experienced DMs, what are some ways you guys handle that when a party half or a third way through the dungeon wants some of that rest, whether you feel like they need it or not?
I certainly will. You can rest wherever you want, but there's going to be potential consequences to that, right? So You're going to try to rest in the dungeon. Actually, I have played some dungeons where you have like a cumulative effect of this dungeon has some sort of power where you're going to start losing some things, and maybe that's behind the screen and they don't even know that until it gets to a certain point. And then I say, hey, by the way, just so you know, this is what's going on. You've been in this dungeon 3 hours now and have accumulated this amount of whatever it might be, right? So you put some overarching kind of detrimental things that happen, so they're most likely not going to want to rest in there. And then I think also on the flip side, if they want to leave and come back, depending what's in that dungeon, maybe they're aware of their presence, or things change, right? So there's a consequence for that as well. So I think you kind of have to go and think about what those things might be, but there certainly should be potential consequences for those actions, I think. So it's on a case by case basis, and just kind of depending what the dungeon entails, and what's actually in that dungeon.
Yeah, I think at the very least, like the monsters could go reset the traps that you had already disarmed. They could maybe call for reinforcements and restock some of the earlier rooms, or now they all know you're coming, and so now they're all on high alert and setting up ambushes, and now they're the ones trying to surprise you. And I also like what Dan said earlier, and I have definitely used this one where there's a narrative clock, such as, okay, well, you have to rescue this person, and if you don't get there by nightfall, well, they maybe sacrifice the Great Cthulhu. And so if you dilly-dally, then, like you said, there will be consequences.
Yeah, so if there's nothing else to do, then they have this unlimited resource of time. So if there is a narrative of time, something that you've got to do, then that human element actually comes back instead of the game element, right? Yeah. The human element is going to say, we should do this because other things are on the line. And so I think between those two things, having a narrative element, having consequences for doing things like that, where you're just like, all right, well, we're going to go back, traps reset, reinforcements come in. I mean, I think those are both useful, or all three of those are kind of useful tools into how you set up your adventuring day and apply consistent pressure to players. And I think they'll learn, because they need to learn, because they will game the player. They will basically metagame the DM, if they know that they can get away with long rests after every encounter. And then what the hell? Why don't we long rest? We'll be good to go.
So I guess, so to kind of double down on my question though, so let's say you're someone like myself running a module, and like maybe you're throwing a little bit of your own flavor in there, maybe you're not, but like maybe a sense of time isn't in there. Like Dan, your campaign, I think you do a great job of that. There's always a clock counting down, and I love that. But without that, it's like, what then? If they're, so I guess that goes back to kind of the stuff Mike was saying, that this stuff could reset, or the traps, they're more prepared and whatnot.
I sort of think if there is no clock, then you sort of designed a video game, right? And I think DMs have to be cognizant of that, and that's sort of a problem in a lot of these. And I haven't played all the modules and things like that, so maybe it's more useful to ask you guys, having played some more of them, if the modules have that. But I know in mine, there's got to be a clock. There has to be, because if there's no time limits, people are going to rest and metagame the DM and rest as much as they can.
Yeah, I think in the modules I've played, I don't know that there's necessarily a clock like we have in your game, for instance, where you're up against a hard time limit of you have to do this by this certain time, right? They don't really, in my experience, they don't really do that necessarily. It's more about having to make certain choices, right? So you could do this or you could do that, and then you have to pick which path you want to take, kind of. So that's like Court of the Dragon Queen and Tyranny of Dragons. It's kind of that way, where you are presented with some options, and then you have to take your choice of what you want to do. And if you don't, whatever you don't do, potentially closes off that path for you. So that's kind of something that they do in the modules.
Rime of the Frostmaiden has some of that, where you get all these rumors and quest hooks, and you can choose to ignore any or all of them that you want. When you start investigating some of them, they may not have a hard time limit given, but it may be something like, Hansel and Gretel have been kidnapped from the local village, and the two winter wolves have them in their lair. And, if you decide to take your time getting out there, the DM's free to say, well, they got eat, they got et.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good thing to do. Like that just happened. You were awful heroes by not being a hero, right? Like, and I think that's great because then they're like, oh gosh, next time I hear a rumor, maybe I should take it more seriously, right? Maybe that was our bad.
I've often found myself being an awful hero in my years of playing.
Solid chaotic neutral alignment usually, yeah.
So when you guys design your adventures, how do you even consider players' resources, or does not totally come into play when thinking about that?
Are you talking about like getting them to consume resources when you're building the yeah.
Yeah, for me, I don't really worry about their resources. It's sort of like the old trap that doesn't have a solution. You just wait to see what the players come up with. I mean, it sounds silly and it sounds like really kind of evil, but players will finally use that potion that they got from first level and they'll be like, what's this fucking thing do? Oh, let's try it. Like, that's when you get weird, and that's when the creative juices start flowing and you start doing some cool things. So I just trust that the 4 hard encounters is going to work, or maybe a deadly or 2, or you're doing 6 to 8. Like, as long as I'm somewhere within that realm and mixing it up, I just assume that the characters are okay. So I never really worry about the character resources when I'm actually designing that much, so long as I'm within the limits.
Do you guys, so when you guys are planning an adventuring day, whether it's, a traveling day or whatever, do you guys tend to track, I know there's the whole maximum experience you're supposed to be able to get in a certain window of time. Do you guys take that into consideration when you're planning your stuff?
I use the milestone personally, so
same.
Yeah, so for me, all my games, anytime I DM a game, I just run it as there's certain points that are bigger strategic, life points, and when you get to that point or past that point, then I feel like, okay, now it's time for you to level up. Or I'm always receptive to player feedback too if they think they've been a level too long or something like that. But ultimately, I'm pretty loose as a goose when it comes to that type of thing.
Gotcha.
Historically, because milestone, I mean, you could have used milestone in previous editions, but I don't think there was an official name or rule for it. So, like back in like 2 and 3, I would only ever use the XP charts. But I never pay attention to any particular hard cap. It's more just my own personal rule that I would just always keep track of where my players are at and know what gets them to the next level, and just gear my encounters and such appropriately, such that I'm not going to be surprised by them going up a level, and they're certainly not going to like jump 2 at once because of a sudden XP surge.
That's a good point. Milestone wasn't a thing, and you had to live hard and fast by those XP charts, and
you did.
Yeah, but you're right though. Certainly, like if your players are 4,000 XP away from a level, you build 2 encounters, let's say 2,000 XP a piece, and you're like, okay, that'll get them to the next level. So something that you used to have to consider, but now not anymore. Now I don't even look at that.
Okay.
Well, I think one of the things that I like to at least consider, although I use the milestone at this point as well, but when you're designing an adventuring day, you sort of got this capstone encounter at the end somehow anyway, or whatever the resolution ends up being. So I kind of consider it to be like an hourglass where it starts fat and you can have all these options and then always thins out to like the end, right? So you're always coming to that conclusion. And so that makes it easy for capstone encounters and milestones. But it doesn't break it if you were doing XP. You just go on to the next adventuring day or whatever you got to do. But I think when you're designing an adventuring day, you sort of have that capstone encounter typically already, I mean, you've wasted all the resources for them to reset. So now you either have to go to the next day or the next adventure. So I don't know. I kind of design it all around that. And I find that usually there's enough XP that's been kind of slammed out during those time periods anyway, that you could theoretically just say, yeah, okay, you leveled up at that point.
I also always wait until a long rest to tabulate and distribute experience points. Like, I'm not going to just distribute experience points after every minor encounter. I make a note of what happened and keep moving. And then, when you reach the next, either end of session or next long rest or whatever good stopping point IRL is, that's when we'll tabulate everything and, tell everybody what they got. Instead of having people trying to, like, midday recalculate their new spells available and their new level abilities.
You're clearly not playing with my children then.
Instant gratification in that game.
They're like, are we there yet? No, but I think the other thing is, I don't think you should think of it in like 6 to 8 short encounters or one deadly encounter. I think it's useful to mix it up. And I think that's also, it keeps the players on their toes too. So I might have a bunch of small encounters, and then in order to bridge to the, maybe there's a boss at that particular one, but then I want to go to a couple hard encounters, you might end up having like something that bridges in between each, quote unquote adventure, So I don't think you should think of it like, well, this is the hard and fast rule. Just knowing that you could have 6 to 8 medium encounters, maybe 4 hard encounters or 2 deadly encounters. I think you need to think of like, well, that's how I'm going to mix it up. And there needs to kind of be places to rest in between those types of ideas when you sort of band out and measure how your adventure is actually going to work.
And I think, that maybe gets where, because I get tripped up on the language again. Like, you say adventuring day, my mind leaps to a day, either 24 hours or sunrise to sunset. And where you're talking more like long rest to long rest, like more like in a, so like using the term adventuring day, you use the term like adventuring unit, but then you're using the term unit. And I don't know if that's a good thing.
That's great.
So it's a good time saying unit.
Yeah.
You need to reset.
I don't know.
Listen, you need to reset your unit every day. So.
I think I do think the adventuring day is a kind of a poorly worded term for what they're actually trying to get after in the DMG,
But it's basically when you're wasting your resources, when you need to reset your resources.
Yeah, right. I understand that's the intent, but certainly my mind goes to 24 hours as well in that span, adventuring day, right? And then you see 6 to 8 encounters, and you're like, well, what the fuck is that? Like, I don't know, I don't see how that makes sense. So it's just, it is what it is. But I think we all understand what the intent actually is.
Well, so I know something I actually found myself thinking about leading up to this discussion was, it was something that I hadn't really thought about before, was that the classes that everybody's playing and how they're affected by, more short or more long. Certain classes are going to obviously benefit from getting that long rest, getting on your spells. So it's like I've kind of said in my little module, I think those such as Dan, who's a sorcerer, he's been doing well. He often is stocked with his spells and stuff like that. So thinking about this has made me think about the pros and cons of trying to sprinkle in a way the short versus long rests, depending on what's in the party and stuff.
I've seen that. I've had that come up in a campaign recently where the one player like playing a warlock is like begging his party, can we please do more short rest? It seems like we only ever do long rest.
Yeah.
Can we just please just 1 hour, guys? Let's just
yeah, like the rogue like never needs a long rest except for health, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it does vary by class to class for sure.
Yeah. Well, and because as I said, mostly I'll do like, 2 or 3 harder or deadly encounters. And then usually, the guys in my module get a short rest. And then I found myself thinking like, well, that could be a good example of when maybe 6 to 8 not so deadly could make that person who's getting the short rest in between those feel a little bit more like, all right, I'm finding my stride. Like this is why I picked this class type of thing,
Yeah, but again, I think today is going to be 6 to 8 goblin encounters and tomorrow you're going to take the goblin layer and it's too hard, too difficult encounters. I think mixing it up in that sense is actually great because if the players know the pacing, like that's on you to switch, and pacing changes. And I think that's what that accordion gets really interesting for the players because you don't know what the hell's about to happen. Should I blow all my resources now? Should I not? I mean, at least for me, and I've seen some people say that they don't love the resource management portion of it. And it's not like you're tallying, sticks and stones and keeping track of it all, right? But it's like, I think that's fun because you don't know what's about to happen. Like, should I have thrown that 5th level spell? I only got 1,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's interesting.
Agreed.
I just don't. That's why I don't worry about the players because then they have regrets, or then they totally knew that was the best move, and it makes it more epic, right? You sort of live in those decisions, and that's what makes the story because of sort of like the dice tell the story. Well, your decisions do too, whether you did pull out the big guns or not, and that was the difference in succeeding or somehow failing in some way.
Yeah, those things that specifically spells, of course, but the class-specific items talents that you have that reset only once per long rest or type of thing, right? That's one of the big ones that you're in the moment and you're like, God, do I pull this out or do I wait or do I not? What do I do, right? And then maybe you have some regret or maybe you don't, depending how it plays out, right?
Yeah, that definitely changes if it's a long rest or a day, and that definitely changes the quality of the magic item depending on what you're playing with that.
I've also seen DMs, and I try to shy away from this because I also I want my players to play their characters like they want, but I can understand the motivation here. I have seen DMs kind of goad players a little bit with their resource management, especially if they can get away with it in like RP terms. If you're the barbarian, you're like, I have 1 rage left, and I'm not sure this is, how many more encounters we've got today. Do I want to burn it? Then DM be like, hey, barbarian, you saw your buddy get smacked in the head. Doesn't that piss you off? And do you really think your guy would just stay calm right now? And him just be like, you're right. Fine. I'll rage, and then he's out of rages when the big bad comes crashing through, and
that's tough.
Your mileage may vary.
You want your player to be happy, and like this would be a good time. So, but you don't want to metagame it too bad,
Yeah, I think it's different if you say, "Hey, barbarian, this guy over in front of you is taunting you." Like, what's your response, right? Other than just saying, like, what's the less metagamey type of thing.
I think I've seen this several times. The long rest potion, where it's just like, have you ever dabbled with that? It works actually surprisingly well, or like the god blesses you with long rest sort of thing. Have you guys used that? Like, I haven't found it bothers me so much, but it is weird because it's not part of the rules, and as a player, I'm never aware of like, oh, this is going to happen. So it's definitely got to be designed into it. But what are you guys' thoughts on? Well, I know I'm going to do back-to-back deadly encounters, so here's your potion or godly blessing of long rest.
I've had it, and they did it at times where you're like, how are we possibly going to defeat this? And then, like, the big good guy shows up and gives you guys a boon, and that's great. So in those moments, I wasn't opposed to it because I was like, I don't see how we could possibly beat this. Like, I was like starting to think of my next character, so I'm like, oh, thank God. And then Dan and Vespa, you guys, I just had a quirky little idea. I had a NPC show up with a smaller version of that, somewhere in between a short and a long rest. But he was a quirky NPC, and in order to get the boon, you had to rhyme for an hour, else you'd take a little bit of psychic damage if you didn't.
Right. So
like that was to me a fun way of giving you guys that, but also, it came at a price a little bit. So I thought that was interesting.
Sure. Yeah, it hasn't bothered me, especially when you're trying to keep that power curve and hit it pretty hard in back to back. I think my biggest problem with that is then you're getting extremely combat heavy. So there's a little bit of you're focused on battle and tactics as opposed to, I don't know, you're a little imbalanced in that sense, but it still works, I guess. You know what I mean? If that's how you need your dungeon to be to get to the last spot.
I'll certainly be the grognard here and say, if he dies, he dies. No long rest potion for me.
I'm somewhere in the middle there. I have been on the receiving end of that as a player way more than I've ever utilized it as a DM. The only times I've utilized it as a DM was with a lot of foreknowledge about a particularly hard dungeon that was my intent, or the players have just maybe they've been on a string of really bad rolls where their tactics has been sound. They've been trying to manage their resources well, but then like the dude casts a fireball and rolls all ones for damage, and then someone else like nat one's a death save, and they've had a string of bad luck, and they're just way lower than I expect them to be at this point. I'll try to find a way to give them something, maybe not a full long rest and just wipe slate clean. Maybe like a short rest potion that or like, they find a deity shrine that gives them all one spell slot back of their choice. So it's not everything. Right. It's not a full reset, but it's some kind of like they find an ammo crate of some size. Very recently the IBA had players like going through a wizard tower trying to unlock this sealed gate. And to unlock it, they had, there's 4 separate rooms, and each one had a hard encounter. One of them, though, was this trapped angel that if they freed her, was going to use her like healing hands ability. And I was prepared to, everyone's going to get like 48 hit points back, and I was prepared to also maybe give all of them either a short rest or a spell slot as part of that. That's her thanking them. But I expected them to do that halfway through or it was the first room they went through. And it's like, well, you're already at full. So, there's not really a whole lot you can do to help you.
So instead of giving you this blessing now, here's the long rest scroll blessing to use in 5 rooms.
Right.
John, to be fair, I don't use that the long rest potion either. I've been a player with it, but I'm a big fan of you done fucked up and you used your resources wrong. And now you're going to pay the fucking price, and one of your buddies might die. And I think that's an epic story. I know it might be, maybe it's harsh, but to be fair, I don't think a lot of people like die that often. So I think it's good to punish them on, you really shouldn't have, destroyed the small caravan of goblins.
I 100% agree with that.
I think that's an easier lesson to learn too when you're like lower levels as well, right? Once you've got characters that are like level 15, and I still would not ever give that potion or scroll or anything out but if let's say you're level 4 and someone dies because of such a mismanagement, let's say, at least you're not super. You haven't been playing the character for a year or 2 years or something, right? Like that's a tough loss in those instances when you.
I'm more inclined to step in that way to avoid a TPK than like a single character death. Like, I'm with you. Like, this is your lesson. What did we learn? Manage your resources better next time. But if it's a complete TPK is about to happen, I'll look for ways like, okay, the person who failed their saving throw, they didn't declare they're using their advantage. I'll let you spend it to get a reroll, or or I might say something like, you didn't declare before you rolled you're going to use advantage. I will give you the reroll, but not only do you have to spend your advantage, another player has to give you theirs as well, and you have to burn 2 advantages now on a reroll, yours and someone else's. And you hear the grumbling, and then like the horse trading of like, come on, man, just give me your advantage.
That's good. I like that.
At least that makes it a co-op again, right?
Yeah,
that's fun. All right, so question. So technically you're only supposed to get 1 short rest or a long rest per adventuring day, per the rules, right? So what, if anything, do you guys do, like if your party kind of tries to sneak one in before? Like, have you guys ever said like, oh, you actually can't, like, kind of meta, like that's not, you can't do that, or will you guys always resort to
Definitely had
in-game
discussions with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, for me, I try and sneak it in where it's like, well, the rules say you can't, so now suddenly I'm a rules lawyer when I'm never a rules lawyer, you know.
Yeah.
But the reason I get that way is because it's like, if your character just wants to sleep, then you should have rolled a fucking tabaxi and be a cat. You know what I mean?
Just
like, yeah, what kind of hero is that? You know, like everyone who loves tabaxis is gonna hate us.
Not us. It's just you.
Just me. Yeah.
You can edit that out if necessary.
But I don't know.
No, but you shouldn't. I mean, you shouldn't.
Yeah, I guess it's
I
not
try
really
to look for.
enough for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've had times where I've been a little annoyed by how often they try to rest, and that's where, you know, going with Dan and Vespa's points, where that's where I try to sneak in the okay, well, now the monsters are going to come looking for you, or, you know, well, now when you get there, the hostage has already been eaten, and you find like their arm is all that's left, or something, you know, that, or they gave one of the magic items to a messenger and sent it off to a different cave. And I mean, I've gone so far as like, you know, again, they tried to like bar the door and sleep, and then I've had, you know, the goblins are outside with like a church pew trying to battering ram the door down. You can't sleep. They're trying to break in here, and the noise they're making won't let you. You can sit in here for 8 hours, but you're not getting the benefit of a rest because it's not restful.
Right.
Well, I think that brings up 2 points. The I like the idea that you can't rest if someone's irritating you, even if you block the door. You know, I don't think you should be able to rest. That's not restful whatsoever. So, and I think using that is a useful way to be like, well, the second point is really this: when you boil down the adventuring day, kind of thematically and literally, it's about the minimum chunk is 1 day. So you should be trying to rest that night. And if you were skimping out on it in some way, then I think that DM could pepper you throughout the night, and then you don't get that.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So that's why I think the adventuring day is good, because the normal scenario identifies that it's just a day. But when you look at it for gritty realism and that's a week or more or whatever, then it becomes more about the adventure or the design. And so then it shouldn't be called the adventuring day, right? It no longer applies.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought if it was a 24-hour period, it's like, yeah, you're not tired. Like, you just slept like 8 hours ago.
Yeah, that's logical, right?
This is boring.
Right.
Yeah, like I wake up in the morning, I don't go out, do my laundry, do one set of laundry, but I'm gonna hit the old trail.
Right.
Clearly, you're not a tabaxi.
Yeah. Dan fuck tabaxi DiPetrio over here.
I actually love tabaxi. I just have cats and they sleep all fucking day, and sometimes they're not fun. No, but I think that's why it's the adventuring day, right? You know, but I think if they are trying to like slow roll an adventure design for some reason, it's fine to incorporate that into saying, hey, you get attacked that night and you did not complete your long rest. And again, I think that comes back to punishment of the players and them learning your pacing, where, you know, they know that they should be moving and not delaying. And if there's that time limit and that they know that you're in an evil woods, well, you know, doing a couple little things in the woods and then sleeping is not really an acceptable mode of operation for an adventurer.
I love the idea of like, not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be a random wandering creature that finds them, but like you said, the goblins banging on the door. Like, yeah, you're safe in the room, but you're not resting. Like, I think that's great.
Or if they've cleared out every room of the dungeon and all that's left is that big bad end guy, and they like go into a room, close the door, bar it up, like we're gonna take a long rest. They get up in the morning. He ran off. He's escaped. And now you've got to go chase him down again.
Right.
While you were all asleep for 8 entire hours, he like just went for a walk, saw all his guards slaughtered, grabbed the treasure, and ran. Like,
absolutely. That's why I say, like, if they leave or depending what they do, there has to be consequences, or should be consequences for that type of thing, you know. And that's how you play it. They leave, they reset their traps, they set new traps. There's new spells that they've put up, depending what's in the dungeon and that type of thing. They call reinforcements, all kinds of things.
Yeah, because the idea that the big bad end guy is just sitting in there on that throne, waiting for him to come through the door. That's video game logic, you know. There's an encounter that's set that's only going to start when the door opens, but until that door opens, he's not doing anything. Like, no, this is an intelligent creature with its own logic and motivations, and it's going to react appropriately.
If players sleep in a dungeon, I like the idea or the thought that maybe, let's say you're in a dungeon, you're going after, like, I don't know, some ogres or goblins or whatever. I like the thought that a different type of monster comes in and invades the dungeon while you're in there. So now you're hemmed in, right? You've got these guys coming in from behind you. You know what's in front of you. You know, that type of thing.
I was just reading something about that. Like, yeah, you clear out the first half, and then maybe some wandering creatures smell the blood in the first half. And they're like, hey, what's going on in here? Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Right. Yeah, so I definitely think consequences helps your pacing. I think time helps the pacing of your adventuring day. I think those are really effective tools. And I also think looking at it, not just a day, but an adventure, and thinking of it using the kind of accordion method, where sometimes you have a bunch of hard encounters, and sometimes you just have a bunch of little ones. And I think if you use those interchangeably and you don't think of it like, well, this is the hard and fast rule. I think people got they often complain about it because they think they read it like a rule and they're not reading it conceptually.
And to be fair to Wizards of the Coast, they've always been like, rule number 1 is like rules number 1 and 2 are have fun and DM has final say. Like these have always been intended as guidelines more than
this
rules.
Is hard and fast, right? You know, so I like the idea of mixing it up though a bit, just to keep your players off balance as well. I think that's important, right? If it's always minor encounter, big bad guy, then they're never going to burn those potential resources because they're ready for that. They know what's coming, right? So I think mixing it up a bit is important as well.
Yeah, I actually did that recently where I've been, since I use the gritty realism, peppering in smaller, and then kind of finishing off with a hard. And that I was doing that a little bit more often, just how the adventure was designed and how they were moving about my campaign. And then the last couple ones, I switched it, and, you know, they made mistakes, right? And things got dicey. And so when you look at it like that, mistakes were made. So I think that's good, though.
I mean, don't things always get dicey in D&D?
So, is that our lead out this time?
But yeah, I mean, what's fun is that because you didn't realize that how your resources were typically being drained, and then suddenly it drained much faster, then your tactics change, and then mistakes get made, and then if you're doing a deadly encounter, then problems can actually arise and characters can die, right? So I do think it's useful to keep it on edge, but, you know, following some of those guidelines, as long as you kind of identify that it's within the realm of, okay, 2 deadly and maybe 4 hard. And, you know, as long as you're somewhere within that, I think you'll be all right. But don't look at it as a hard and fast rule, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, so that is the adventuring day. So if you have any questions, leave it in the comments. Make sure to subscribe. We'll be doing another one in a couple weeks here. And until the next one, keep rolling. Or slice and dice, should I say? Slice and dice?
Keep rolling.
Keep rolling. Yeah.
Get dicey?
Okay, that's all right.
All right, thanks everyone.